Our speaker today is Rupert Sheldrake, an innovative and controversial biologist, author of over 75 technical papers and books. Very interesting, I must say. Most recently, The Sense of Being Stared At. He studied at Cambridge and is director of the Parrot Warwick project there, funded by Trinity College. And he's going to speak about some research he's doing on that project about extraordinary or unexplained abilities of humans and animals. So there's going to be a 45-minute talk, followed by 15 minutes for questions and answers. Let's welcome Rupert Sheldrake.
Oh dear, the slides have gone on to... Sorry, just a moment. Okay. Thank you. I'm talking about the extended mind, the mind beyond the brain. And I'm going to start with a few reflections on the nature of consciousness. We don't know how consciousness works or what it does. This is one of the things which in science is sometimes called the hard problem, because there's no known obvious reason why we should be conscious at all, or exactly how the mind works. And consciousness studies is one of the most exciting frontier areas of science today. What I'm going to suggest is that our minds are field-like, that they're not confined to the inside of the head. They spread out into the environment around us. And because our minds are extended beyond our brains, they can have effects at a distance, which are surprising from the conventional point of view, and help to make sense of a range of controversial phenomena like telepathy. So the first point is that the question of where is the mind located. I'm suggesting that minds are field-like and spread out beyond brains in a similar way to the way that magnetic fields spread out beyond magnets, cell phone fields spread out beyond cell phones, and the Earth's gravitational field stretches out far beyond the Earth. These fields are within and around the material systems they organize. And I think the same is true of our brains. The place where this becomes easiest to understand is in terms of vision and the question of how vision works. Most people think they know how vision works, and science has told us a great deal about it. And what we know is that when you see me standing here now, for example, light is reflected from me, goes through the electromagnetic field, inverted images appear on your retinas, changes happen in the cone cells, and then impulses travel up the optic nerves and various bits of your brain become active. That's what happens during the physical side of perception. There are two problems here. First of all, there's no explanation in this as to why you should be conscious at all. That's simply not explained by describing what happens in the nervous system. And the second problem is that, according to the standard view, all this is supposed to be happening inside your brain. If the mind is nothing but the brain, which is the usual assumption within the academic and medical worlds, mental activity is nothing but brain activity, everything you're seeing is inside your head. Somehow, miraculously, in an unexplained way, changes in your nervous cells lead to a kind of virtual reality display inside your head by which you see what's going on in the world. So right now, for example, somewhere inside your head, there's a little virtual Rupert somewhere in your brain, and you think it's out here as I'm standing here talking. If you look at the sky you're seeing is an image of the sky inside your head, so your skull must be beyond the sky. A recent paper in a leading consciousness journal was called, "Is Your Skull Beyond the Sky?" Because if the sky you see is inside your head, the skull must be beyond the sky. The answer of the author was yes. My answer would be no. In fact, I suggest the very common sense view, a view that's so simple it's hard to grasp, that when you're seeing something, the image you're seeing is where it seems to be. Your image of me is located not inside your head, but right here. It's in your mind, produced by your mind, but it's not in your brain. It's projected out. And I'm suggesting our whole visual experience of the world is projected out to where it seems to be. Our minds are projecting out all that we see. So vision's a two-way process, light coming in and the outward projection of images. This, I suggest, happens through what I call a perceptual field, which is a kind of morphic field, another category of field that is part of a theory I've developed, which I don't have time to explain today. But it's a field phenomenon, and in a sense, your mind reaches out to touch what you're looking at. The image of what you're seeing is superimposed on what's really there. Sometimes it's not, as in a mirror reflection when you have a virtual image, or in an illusion or a hallucination, but usually it is. So what I'm suggesting is that you can, by looking at things, your mind touches them. There's a sense in which you might be able to affect things just by looking at them. Is this true? Can you affect anything by looking at it? Think of another person. Can you affect another person by looking at them? Of course, if they see you looking at them, we all know you can. But what if you're looking at them from behind, through a car window, for example, no sound, no smell, they can't see you're there, they don't know you're there. Can you affect them just by looking at them? Well, most people think that that does happen. 90% of the population have had the experience of feeling that sometimes when they're being looked at from behind, they turn around, someone's looking at them. Surveys show that more women than men have had that experience. It's still a very large majority. More men than women have had the experience of looking at others and making them turn around. But most men and women have had both these experiences, and I guess most people in this room have experienced these things personally. So the sense of being stared at is a well-known phenomenon. It's found all over the world. Children know about it, adults know about it, but it's not part of the standard scientific map. You won't find any reference to it in psychology textbooks. There's virtually no research literature on this until about 15 years ago. And it's extraordinarily under-researched in spite of the fact it's very well known. The standard scientific education that most of us receive makes us think, well, this must be some kind of illusion. So probably most people in this room have been trained to dismiss the phenomenon by saying, oh, it's just a coincidence. You turn around all the time. If no one's looking at you, you forget about it. If they are, you think there's some mysterious sense involved, but it's really nothing but either coincidence or peripheral vision or something like that. That's the standard way of explaining it away. But now many experiments have been done to test whether this is real. And the simplest experiment involves people working in pairs. One sits with a blindfold with their back to another. The other person either looks or doesn't look at them in a randomized sequence, and in each trial, the person has to guess if they're being looked at or not. Hundreds of thousands of these trials have been done. The overall results show a positive, very significant effect. When things are repeated over hundreds of thousands of trials with many independent replications, they become very significant, even though, as in this case, the effect is fairly small. These experiments have also been done in Amsterdam in the Science Museum in one of the largest experiments ever conducted for more than 20 years. This experiment's been running, more than 20,000 participants have taken part. The results are, again, overwhelmingly positive and significant. Rather surprisingly, this phenomenon also occurs through closed-circuit television. Various experiments have been done whereby people's skin conductance is measured with electrodes on their fingers. This measures emotional arousal. And it turns out that there's a significant change in people's emotional arousal when they're being looked at through closed-circuit television by someone on a monitor in a different room. This work's been replicated as well. One of the people who's done it, Marilyn Schlitz, is right here in the Bay Area. Indeed, she's right here in this room. So there's now a substantial body of work showing that people can tell when they're being looked at, even through closed-circuit television. This is something which has become of great interest to the security agencies, and I can't divulge exactly who or why, but I can tell you that the security forces are very interested in this question. Could a potential terrorist, for example, tell when they're being watched through closed-circuit television? The answer to that is probably yes, if they've trained their sensitivity a bit. This phenomenon is well known to security guards. Most security guards are well aware that if people are looked at from behind, they can tell when they're being looked at. Private detectives know that when they're shadowing people, when they're following them, they shouldn't stare at their back because the person's likely to turn around and catch their eye and blow their cover. People in the martial arts know about this, and there are martial arts methods for training your sensitivity to feeling people's intentions or looks from behind. And in the closed-circuit television industry, which now involves millions of CCTV cameras engaged in surveillance work, many operatives know that you can affect people by looking at them. I gave a talk about this in Washington, D.C. last year, and one of the guys in the audience told me afterwards that he was, in fact, a security guard. And when he was trained by an FBI trainer, they told him, if you see someone doing something they shouldn't do, just stare at them hard on the screen, and they'll probably stop it. And I said to him, does that work? And he said, sure, I do see it almost every day. He said, we all know this stuff. He was amazed that this is a controversial issue within the academic scientific world, because people in the security industry take this for granted. In the British Special Services, the SAS, when people are being trained how to stab others in the back, they're trained that you don't stare at the person's back before you stab them, because they're likely to feel it, turn around and shoot you. So these things are completely taken for granted, yet they're a huge scientific anomaly. It shouldn't happen if the mind's all in the brain, but if our visual activity involves the outward projection of images, and even a kind of resonant projection when you see something on a computer screen, it's not a direct effect. In that case, just seeing the image can affect the person. Something else is going on. I think our minds are in fact extended beyond our brains in every act of attention and perception. And this is not a new view. It's a view put forward by Plato and other Greek philosophers. It's the view of perception in most Hindu and Buddhist philosophies. It's the view taken for granted by traditional people all over the world. And it's the view taken for granted by Western children under the age of 10 or 11. Studies on children's intellectual development shows that most children assume that vision involves this outward projection. That's why Superman comics and things show rays coming out of the eyes of superheroes. It's a very popular childlike way of seeing or understanding. Piaget, the developmental psychologist who studied children's intellectual development, said that by the age of about 10 or 11, the average child learns the correct view, which is that thoughts and images are invisible things located inside the head. We've all been brought up with the correct view, in spite of the fact there's virtually no evidence for it. No one's ever seen a thought or an image inside a head. And our own experience of seeing things outside us directly contradicts this theory. So we've bought into a theory that's totally at variance with our most immediate experience. And I'm suggesting our minds reach out beyond our brains, and the sense of being stared at is one aspect of this. Animals feel it too. Many animals can tell when they're being looked at. There's a lot of evidence for this from wildlife photographers and hunters. And many people say that they can feel when animals are looking at them. Jim Corbett, who was a famous tiger shooter during the British Raj in India, author of books like Man-Eaters of Kumaon, said that his life had been saved on many occasions by feeling the look of a hidden tiger. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he felt this tiger's presence and escaped. I think that this isn't just something that happens between people and animals and people and people. I think it happens between animals and other animals. And it may well have evolved in a predator-prey situation. If prey animals could tell when predators were looking at them, they'd tend to escape better. And the natural history of this is virtually uninvestigated because it's been a taboo area, not really on the scientific map until quite recently. Anyway, as I say, this is an area where there's research going on actively at present. And it's one of the ways in which our minds seem to be extended beyond our brains and have effects which ought not to occur within the standard view of things, but which do seem to occur and which most people have actually experienced themselves. And this is one of the phenomena that I call a mystery of everyday life. It's something almost everybody, even every child, knows about. But most scientists have been trained not to think about it or to dismiss it because it doesn't fit the paradigm or the model. If we move to this extended mind model, it makes good sense. There's another way in which the extended mind idea makes better sense of our experience than the idea that it's all in the brain. And that's to do with the way that social animals are coordinated with each other. All social animals have to work together, by definition, in a harmonious way for the society to hold together. And this is shown most graphically in the case of flocks of birds. Here you see a flock of starlings. The flock can fly together. They can turn immensely quickly without bumping into each other. Here are some other pictures of flocks of birds, of starlings, and the astonishing maneuvers that they make. Some of you will be familiar with animation, computer animations of bird flocks like Craig Reynolds' classic Boyd's model from the 80s, which seem to show you can just explain it by nearest neighbor sensations. Actually, you can't. Those models are biologically naive. They assume that birds look at their nearest neighbor, process the information, adjust their flight, and change direction. That takes a lot of time. Nervous systems work slowly compared with computers. And the birds are reacting too fast for that to happen. The best computer models are field models that treat the whole flock as a field phenomenon. And I think they are indeed field phenomena, that members of social groups are linked through social fields or morphic fields of the social group. The same applies, of course, to schools of fish, like this one. And especially when predators attack, they can scatter in different directions very rapidly without bumping into each other. The whole group seems to move as a unit, as a kind of field. And the individuals move in response to the field, which is both produced by the individuals and acts back upon them. It's more than the sum of the parts acting. It's a kind of emergent field phenomenon. I think all social animals have such fields joining them together, even when they move apart. A pack of wolves, for example, has a morphic field of the group. When some of them go away, like adult wolves go hunting to fetch food for the young that are left in the den, the field isn't broken, it stretches. And I think they remain connected at a distance through this stretched field. A change in one can affect the other through this field that connects them. That, I think, is the basis of telepathy. I think it's a normal means of communication among separated members of animal groups, or even non-separated members. I don't think it's paranormal, I think it's normal, I don't think it's supernatural, I think it's natural, and I think it's essentially a form of animal communication within groups. Another way of thinking about this is through quantum entanglement, and Dean Radin, who gave a talk here at Google some time ago, a few months ago, has written a book called Entangled Minds, suggesting that when people have close social relationships and interactions, their minds become entangled, so that when they separate, there's still an entanglement between them, so a change in one is reflected by a change in another. Quantum non-locality, entanglement of quantum particles, is well known, well documented, and it's in fact the basis of now technological applications in quantum cryptography and quantum computing. And what that shows is that particles that are part of the same system, when they move apart, a change in one is immediately associated with a change in the other. This is independent of distance, unlike many other physical phenomena. It doesn't matter if it's an inch apart or a mile apart. It's distance-independent entanglement or non-local connection. I'm suggesting something like that happens in the case of animal groups and in social groups in general, including human groups. And because I think it's basically an animal phenomenon that we share in because we're animals, rather than some kind of spiritual phenomenon that only humans have, my first studies on telepathy were with animals. And I started with the animals we know best, like cats and dogs and other animals that people live with and get to know very well, and which form bonds with their human companions. The first stage in this research was natural history. Every science begins with natural history, and no one had ever done this. So I collected lots and lots of stories about people, about their pets. What did they see in their pets' behavior that suggested something might be going on beyond normal sensory information? I soon collected thousands of these stories that I classified in a whole series of different categories on a computer database. The fact that people report these phenomena doesn't prove they're right about their reports. But for me, the plural of anecdote is data. And when you have hundreds of reports of the same kind of phenomenon from all over the world, at least it shows lots of people are observing or think they're observing the same kind of thing. And that then has to be investigated further. For example, on our database, we have hundreds of reports from cat owners saying their cat seems to read their mind and know when they're planning to take it to the vet. The cat disappears. And after it's happened a few times, people try to avoid giving the cat any clues. They don't let it see the carrying basket. They try not to think of the word vet. Some people even ring the vet from work so the cat doesn't overhear the conversation. And then they swing by home on the way back from work to pick it up, and it's still not there. So many of these stories that we did a survey of all the veterinary clinics in the North London Yellow Pages, 65 of them, rang them up and said, do you ever have a problem with people missing appointments with cats? 64 out of 65 said, yes, it happens all the time. And the remaining ones said, it happens so often we've given up the appointment system for cats. People just have to turn up with them. With dogs and cats, another very common phenomenon is the animals knowing when their owners are coming home. A lot of dogs and cats wait at a door or window when the owner's on the way home. Even if they come at non-routine times, even if they come by public transport, even if they're in a friend's car, and even if the people at home don't know when they're coming. Many, many of these stories, about 800 of these stories with dogs on our database, about 500 with cats. Also stories about lambs that are raised by hand on milk that do it, a few rabbits and guinea pigs and ferrets that do it, parrots, parakeets, budgerigars that do it. A range of animals do this, but all of them are mammals and birds. I haven't come across any cases of return anticipating reptiles. I've tried hard to find such cases, and including launching appeals for information in journals like Reptilian International. And I haven't come across any convincing cases of snakes, monitor lizards, or fish like goldfish, or insects like stick insects seeming to feel this. It only seems to happen with mammals and birds that form close bonds with their owners. Well, is this just an illusion? When I discussed it with one of my skeptical colleagues in Cambridge, Nicholas Humphrey, who's a psychologist, to my surprise, he didn't deny the phenomenon. In fact, he said, well, my dog used to do that. My mother always knew when I was coming home, the dog would go to the door. And I said, but surely the dog couldn't have heard your car from the other side of Cambridge from many miles away against all the traffic that's there, irrespective of the wind direction. And he said, oh, on the contrary, it just shows what sharp hearing they've got. And because he and I differ in many respects in our opinions, yet we share a belief in science and scientific method, this led to the idea for an experiment. And the experiment is the person goes at least 5 miles from home. The place where the dog waits is filmed continuously on time-coded videotape. The person comes home at a randomly chosen time communicated by a pager. They don't know that in advance. The people at home, if any, don't know when they're coming. And to avoid familiar car sounds, they travel by unfamiliar vehicles, like taxis. Well, I've now done hundreds of those kinds of experiments with dogs, and the results are pretty clear-cut. The dogs go and start waiting over and over again when the person's coming home. In fact, with the most sensitive dogs, when they form the intention to come home before they've even got into the taxi. This research has been written up. It's published in journals. You can see the full reports on my website. And it's now being replicated by an online open source science project where people are putting up pictures of their dogs waiting at the door on YouTube. So you can actually see ongoing experiments of this kind. This slide shows a survey of dogs and cats that do this, a random household survey done in 2 locations in Britain and 2 in California. You'll see that about 50% of dogs are reported by their owners to anticipate the arrival of a member of the family. An average of about 30% of cats. For some reason, the Californian cats do it more than British cats. We haven't worked out why. But even in Los Angeles, where the most impressive animals seem to live, cats do it less than dogs. And that doesn't necessarily prove cats are less sensitive than dogs. It may just prove that some of them are less interested. In these experiments with dogs that know when their owners are coming home, we've done lots of these experiments. You can read the details online if you want to. But basically, what these graphs show is the number of seconds the dog stays at the window. And these are 10-minute intervals after the person leaves home. You see, the dog does sometimes go to the window when they're not coming home, like here and here. And when you see the videos, in most of these cases, they're going to look at things going on outside, to bark at passing cats and so on. They're obviously not waiting, but we've included all the data so there's no bias introduced by any subjective judgment. What you see is the 10 minutes of the first 10 minutes of the homeward journey, there, and there. The dogs are at the window most. And they're there also before the person actually gets in the car and the car starts moving. That's because people form the intention to go home before the car actually moves. You have to think about it before you get in the car. But the highest amount of time at the window is when they're on the way home. These data were, of course, challenged by skeptics. As you know, anything to do with telepathy is immensely controversial. There are vigilante organizations that have been set up to try and discredit research of this kind. There are active groups of highly motivated skeptics. They vastly outnumber researchers in this field. The total number of subscribers to skeptical magazines in the US is about 100,000. The total number of full-time researchers in parapsychology is about 5. So they're outnumbered about 20,000 to 1 by well-organized groups of skeptics. And so, of course, and rightly so, this work was criticized by skeptics. One of them, Richard Wiseman, a British media skeptic and psychologist, said that I must have made mistakes in the result, faulty randomization, the wrong kind of vehicle to bring people home. So I invited him to do his own experiments with with one of the same dogs, the same dog I worked with here. And these are the results of the 3 experiments he did in the same location. As you see, it's an almost perfect replication. The most time the dog was at the window was in the first 10 minutes of the homeward journey. And showed exactly the same kind of pattern. At first, he argued these refuted my results because the dog went to the window before the owner set off, and the rest of the data could therefore be discarded. But in fact, most people don't think that's a valid approach. I certainly don't. He himself now admits that this is, in fact, a replication of the effect. He doesn't agree with my interpretation, but his own results clearly replicated the same pattern as my own. Not only animals, but people commonly show telepathic behavior or sensitivities. These things are widely believed in our society. The great majority of people in America, Britain, Germany, South America, India, in fact, all over the world, think they've had telepathic experiences. Skeptics dismiss this by saying, well, these are just uneducated people prone to illusion, and it's all just a delusion in their minds, a false interpretation of what's happened to them, an inadequate understanding of chance and statistics, and so forth. You're all familiar with those arguments. But starting as a biologist, I wanted to look at the things where this happens most commonly and most biologically. One case in the human realm is with mothers and babies. Many mothers claim that they can feel when their baby needs them. A lot of nursing mothers have what's called the milk letdown reflex. That, for the benefit of the men here, which is the majority, is a reflex that occurs with nursing mothers. Normally, when they hear the baby cry, there's a release of oxytocin from the brain that causes the breast to prepare to feed the baby. There's special changes occur in the breast. The nipples start leaking. Many women experience a tingling sensation. Some women experience that when they're away from their baby. They may be shopping in a supermarket, and suddenly their milk lets down. They feel their breast tingle. Most women, when that happens, assume that the baby needs them. They used to just go home. Nowadays, they call home on a cell phone. They're often right. Not always, but very often. And I've done detailed studies on breastfeeding mothers in London that show that the odds against this happening by chance at the time the baby really does need them the odds are about 1 billion to 1 against chance in the study I did. So I think there's something really going on there, and this is a very good area to study telepathy. It's very biological. It's easy to see why natural selection might have favored this ability. A mother who knows when her absent baby needs her is more likely to have a baby that survives than a mother that doesn't know. And so I think that natural selection favors these abilities. They have an evolutionary reason for being there. They're not just sort of curiosities on the very fringes of parapsychology. They're central aspects of life, and until the invention of modern telecommunications, the only way that a mother could know her baby needed her immediately when she was far away from it was through telepathy. It's the only way people or animals could communicate at a distance until the invention of telegraphs and telephones. Well, telephones are, in fact, one of the ways in which telepathy emerges most strongly in the modern world. It's evolved along with technology, and right now it's on the increase because people use telephonic communications so much. Surveys show that the great majority of people have had experiences of what I call telephone telepathy. You think of somebody for no apparent reason, and then that person calls, and you say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." Surveys in a variety of countries have shown that more women than men claim this experience, about 95 or 96% of women, about 72% of men. There are some national differences in men. The most sensitive men in our survey were in Argentina, the least sensitive in Britain. With other kinds of telepathy, the figures are still way above the 50% mark. They're a majority of people, but much less common than telephone telepathy. So what's going on here? It's very common. I imagine most people in this room have experienced it. Is this just an illusion? What do the skeptics say? Well, what the skeptics say, and what most people in this room have probably been trained to say, and probably heard said very often, is, oh, well, it's just a coincidence. You think of people all the time, one of them rings, and then you think, oh, well, it must have been telepathy, but you forget the millions of times you were wrong. A reasonable hypothesis, chance, coincidence, and selective memory, but where's the data? In science, it's not enough to put forward an armchair hypothesis. You need data. Skeptics have been advancing that argument for 100 years since the invention of the telephone, and there was not one shred of data to support it. And nothing in science deserves a free ride, and you need evidence. Anyway, I've developed a test to try and find out what's really going on. Is it just coincidence or not? For that, you need statistical experiments. And how I've been doing these tests is as follows. Imagine you're somebody who has this experience and you volunteer to be a subject in one of these experiments. You give me the names of 4 people you might be telepathic with, typically people you're closely related to, family members, girlfriends, boyfriends, close colleagues, people you know well. You give me their numbers and their names. You sit at home, you're videotaped continuously while you sit by a landline telephone with no caller ID system. We then pick one of your 4 callers at random using a randomizing device, call them up and ask them to phone you. They phone you. The phone rings. Before you pick it up, you guess who it is. I think it's John. You pick it up. Hi, John. You're right or you're wrong. It's an objective fact. It's on film. And your chance by getting it right by just guessing is 25%, 1 in 4. Well, in these experiments, the chance rate, the 25% chance rate is there, and the actual hit rate, 45%, is what we found. And this was with hundreds of tests, and the probability figure for this is 1 times 10 to the minus 12. In other words, this is way beyond what you'd expect by chance. This is a highly significant, statistically significant result. It's not just chance. Whatever it is, it's not just chance. We then did these tests where 2 of the 4 callers were strangers that people had never met, but whose names they knew. The other 2 were people they knew well. And here we found with the unfamiliar callers, the success rate was pretty well at the chance level, just above. With the familiar callers, it was way above chance, in this case 52%. So these telephone telepathy tests are a new way of testing for telepathy. They've given highly significant positive results. There's no effect of distance in accordance with other research on telepathy. We did some of our experiments with young Australians and New Zealanders who'd recently arrived in London, whose nearest and dearest were at the Antipodes, the other side of the world. Their hit rates were actually higher with people in Australia and New Zealand than with new acquaintances in England, showing that what matters is emotional proximity rather than physical proximity. And this has now been replicated in a number of studies at Cape Town University, at Amsterdam University by Dick Bierman and his colleagues, and recently at Freiburg University in Germany. And it was also done as a replication for a TV show in Britain under controlled conditions with the Nolan sisters, who were an 80s girl band. And that's now available on YouTube. You can actually see, there's a 5-minute clip showing that experiment. You can get to it through my website, www.sheldrake.org. But if you're interested in seeing one of these tests, you can do that easily enough. The latest evolution of telepathy is in connection with emails. The same kind of things now started happening with emails. Lots of people think of someone, then they get an email from them. They say, that's funny, I was just thinking about you. We've done very similar experiments with emails, 4 emailers, random choice of who's going to email you. People have to guess just before they get the email who's sending it. We have fixed times for this experiment. You know that you'll get an email at, say, 4 o'clock. So at 3:59, you have to send me an email with your guess. Then the person sends their email at 4 o'clock, and with a CC to me. From the emails themselves, we know to the exact second when the guess was sent and when the actual email was sent. And so we can show that the guesses are made before the email has been sent. It's built into the technology. We've done those also with people being filmed for security reasons to make sure they're not cheating by means of mobile phones, regular phones, MSN Messenger, or anything like that. And the results of the email experiments show a similar effect. The chance level of 25%, the film tests 47% is the hit rate. And again, we get a higher hit rate with the familiar than the unfamiliar callers. We also found no effect of distance in these email telepathy tests. Well, these tests lend themselves to automation. And I've recently been, in the last couple of years, developing a whole set of automated online tests for telepathy. Some of them are automated email tests. The whole of this can be done online, where you register online, you put in the names of your emailers, the computer selects an emailer at random, asks them to send you an email by sending them an email. So the whole thing's done by email, and all the results are recorded in an online database. I also have a similar experiment working with text message tests on mobile telephones. And those, both the email and the automated text message tests are giving significant positive results. These are being done by anyone who wants to do them. It's completely open science. I don't know that some of those people couldn't have been cheating. Perhaps they were. There's not much incentive, I think, to cheat because most people are trying to find out how telepathic they are, and there's no point doing it if you're cheating. But some of them could have been. The only way to deal with the cheating thing is for anyone to do it themselves. If you do it, you'll know if you're cheating or not. You could do it with a group of friends who you trust and see what the group results come up with. These can be set as classroom experiments in colleges and schools, and some instructors are already doing this. And when you register for the test, you put in a group name, and people could then recover all the results from that group name online, on the online database. So in some universities, instructors have set these as homework assignments. In a study in scientific methodology, it triggers off a very lively debate among students. It gives results generally positive, which bring in debates about the nature of statistics, and also a debate about could some people have been cheating, and if so, who? The only way you can really guard against cheating is either by trusting people, which you won't trust me if you're a skeptic or anyone else, but you can trust yourself and your friends, hopefully. or by having experiments done under oppressively rigorous conditions where people have strip searched for hidden mobile phone devices, implanted telephonic tooth implants, and spy-type equipment. Skeptics will go to any length to say that people must have been cheating. And actually, there's only a limited number of precautions you can take against it in practical terms. So that's why by having these experiments wide open for anyone to do, at least you can organize your own group, do your own test. And this area of research can now be participatory. You don't have to take my word for it or anyone else's word. These are all published in peer-reviewed journals. You can read the texts online on my website. But you can do it yourself as well. The latest experiment, which has only just become technically possible, which is now being programmed in England and should be ready soon, is an automated straight telephone telepathy test where you register online. If you're picked to make the phone call, you get a text message or an email telling you to call your friend. You call a landline number, which is, say, a dedicated landline number. You get a message welcoming you to the test. You give your group number so it knows who you are, who the people are involved in the test. And then it rings the subject and says, there's one of your callers waiting on the phone to talk to you. Who is it? Press 1 for Jim, press 2 for Susan, press 3 for Bill. You make your guess, and as soon as you made your guess, the line opens up and you get to talk to them. These experiments, I think, have the potential for being very popular participatory experiments. I've been talking to people in the mobile telephone industry, and some of them are interested in developing intuition tests programmed into the phone. These won't be experiments, but ways of training your intuition. Instead of a caller ID when the call comes in, there'll be a simple program, easy to do, which says who's calling. You know, and then quick key, you can have a quick key thing. You press 1 for Jane, 2 for Jill, 3 for Bill, etc. If you don't know who's calling, if you're in a hurry, you just answer it and you pass. But if you do make a guess, it'll keep a record, and you'll see how many you've got right. You can see if you're getting better with time, if you're training your intuition. And this way, we could find more talented subjects for our more rigorous experiments. I have a variety of online experiments proceeding right now. Another one is a photo telepathy test. And what that involves is two people do this test. One of you, when you register, you upload a photo of one of the people. There's a series of 20 10-second trials. And in each trial, the subject just sits there. It says trial 1 begins, and the 10 seconds pass. The other person either sees your photo, or they see a photo of something completely different. At the end of 10 seconds, a box comes up. Was your partner looking at your photo? Yes, no. You click. And you can have feedback or not as you choose at the beginning of the test. The data are all stored online. It's a fun experiment to do. And I'd like any feedback you have about how best to spread these kinds of experiments. But several people have suggested this would work very well on Facebook or other social networking sites, because the problem I have is to get people to go to their computers at the same time as other people to do experiments. Most people are too busy. It's hard to arrange. In Facebook, they're all online. You've got people online anyway waiting to interact, and here's a way they can interact in a way that's fun to do. Can you tell if someone else is looking at your photo? The results so far suggest that people can. Positive, significant results. I also have a joint attention test designed to answer the question, when you're looking at the same thing as somebody else, do your minds come into a kind of resonance? Can you tell when someone else is looking at the same thing as you? In that test, there's 20 trials. Each trial has 2 pictures. By chance, you're looking at the same one or a different one in each trial. And after 10 seconds, each of you has to guess, was your partner looking at the same picture? That, again, is giving positive above-chance results. If joint attention works so that there's a kind of resonance you can actually feel when one other person's looking at it, what about real television? What about So 50 million people watching Obama's acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention. Now, that's a bad example for doing an experiment because everyone knew it was happening. But with regular TV, if you went into a room, 2 rooms adjacent, 2 booths, each have TV running. One of them is showing live TV that's actually playing right now to millions of people. The other one's showing a TiVoed or recorded program that was broadcast hours or days ago that probably no one else but you is watching at this moment. Can people tell the difference? Interesting experiment, huge relevance to modern media, which involve millions of people having their attention focused on the same thing at the same time. No one knows the answer because that experiment has not yet been done. But I mention it because some of these experiments are immensely relevant to modern media. Many of them are very cheap to do. Many of them very simple to do. Many of them work through interactive websites. And I think this is an area of research which can not only involve a lot of people, but can also involve a kind of public debate about the results. The results can be, the programming can be transparent. All my tests, anyone who wants to can see the coding, study the randomization system, and so forth. And in Britain, I've recently been doing a project with one of our leading skeptics, a very intelligent and reasonable skeptic. Some are dogmatic, ideologically motivated, and I think go way beyond any limits of science and reason in bigotry and prejudice. But we have one in Britain, the editor of the British Skeptic magazine, Professor Chris French, who's a friend of mine, and he's been running some of my tests himself while I've been here on the West Coast over the last month or 2. And when I get back, I'm going to find out just what he found. So far, looking online, the results he's got are coming out positive and in line with the kinds of tests I've been doing myself. But this is something where open-minded skeptics and proponents can cooperate on research, where the results can be easily obtainable, and where there can be research going on way beyond the narrow limits of academic laboratories with papers just in peer-reviewed journals that no one reads anyway, to participatory research which can engage large numbers of people. So that's more or less the state of the art. And a few other people are engaged in this kind of thing. There are a number of researchers in parapsychology and psychology doing this kind of research. 1 or 2 other people are doing online tests, notably Dean Radin, who spoke here at Google recently. But I'll just end by saying that the idea of the extended mind, the mind beyond the brain, a mind that stretches out through fields, gives us a way of extending the frontiers of science. We're not leaving behind science and reason and descending into a kind of black mud of superstition, as Freud called it. We're extending the realm of science to phenomena which are widely known about, which most people are really interested in, and which may well have a perfectly good scientific explanation, but which haven't been part of the rather narrower kind of science that we're used to. So I think that this is important because it makes science more relevant, not less. It expands science, and it makes science more interesting to more people. So I think this is a good thing. I think that some people think it's a bad thing, but anyway, that's my opinion. And I'd be interested to take any questions or comments that you may have. Yeah.
Are you ever able to introduce noise to the system?
Noise.
So for example, let's say you had 2 callers and 1 person that was being called, and one of the lines were cut, and the caller didn't know whether the lines were cut. So both people have the intention of calling, but only one person is actually making it through.
Yes.
Have you performed that experiment? If so, does that affect the results?
A good question. I mean, could we actually interrupt these experiments randomly? I haven't tried doing that. It could be done. The trouble is, in the interests of full disclosure, when you get people to take part in experiments, you have to tell them what they're going to do. You know, it's most committees, ethics committees require you to disclose the experiment. So it would be hard to have random interruptions of tests without telling people in advance that this might happen. In which case, you might change their intention. They might think, well, maybe nobody's really going to be answering the phone. So I think it could interfere with it. But I think it's an interesting point, yes.
Ever since Dean came here earlier this year, I've been telling a lot of people about psi. And basically, the conversation usually ends as soon as the person I'm speaking with thinks of James Randi. And they kind of put up a James Randi shield where they won't let anything get past. And
Yes.
I was wondering, what your response to that is.
Well, for the benefit of those who don't know about him, there's a conjurer called James Randi who often appears on TV, and he's a very he's one of these ideologically motivated skeptics who believes psi is impossible. And he's offered $1 million prize, or says he has. There's a lot of questions as to whether he actually has the $1 million or where it is, for any successful test of psi. And people often say, why don't you apply for the Randi Prize? Well, it's a very good question, and I can tell you my answer. First of all, this man is not a scientist. He has no scientific credentials or understanding. On his website, it says the prize must be won for people who produce an unequivocal demonstration of psi abilities that requires no expert analysis. That seems to rule out any statistical experiments. Then he's later said, oh, well, I will accept statistical experiments, but the odds against chance have got to be 1,000,000 to 1 to get the $1 million prize. So if the odds against chance are 900,000 to 1, you fail the test. Third, you sign over to Randi all publicity rights. You have all legal waivers. So he has complete control of all publicity arising from this. And fourth, and most important for me, he's a liar. He's a deceiver by profession, and he's a deceiver by nature. And my reason for saying this, without being sued for libel, is that he wrote an article in a magazine about my dog research called Dog World. Probably very few of you read Dog World, but lots of people do. And in this, he said that we at the James Randi Educational Foundation have repeated Sheldrake's experiments. They fail. Then he said, we've also examined all his videotape from his experiments and shown the dog goes to the window all the time, and it's not as he says it is. An unequivocal statement. I emailed him asking him to give me the details of the experiments he'd done. What journal were they published in? Where's the data? Reasonable questions that a scientist would ask. He didn't reply. I emailed again, he didn't reply. So I emailed his scientific advisory board, and they advised him to reply. So he then replied, and he said, well, actually, these experiments were done many years ago when I looked after a friend's dogs for a couple of weeks in New York, and I lost all the data. They were lost in a flood, so I've got no data, and they've never been written up. So what kind of evidence is that? If I produce evidence for psi and say, well, I did them years ago, I've lost all the data, but just believe me, he wouldn't go for that, I'm sure. And then the examination of the videotapes, he had to admit he'd never seen the videotapes. He'd simply made that up. Now, with a man with such a low degree of honesty, I don't think he should be an arbiter of scientific credibility or truth. I do believe, however, that real skeptics, people with proper skeptic scientific training and who have a track record of honesty rather than dishonesty, are worth engaging with, and that's why I'm doing joint experiments with Professor Chris French right now.
Thanks.
Thank you for a great talk. As an open-minded skeptic. So you mentioned your fondness for the scientific method, but there's a very key but subtle difference between a scientific study and a statistical study. A scientific study has to include a falsifiable theory of how this works. Do you think that that's an unnecessary assumption and science should expand beyond it? Or do you think that these experiments actually do have some sort of a theory?
Well, that's a good point. And first of all, I don't think that all science requires a theory. No one knew till recently how aspirin worked. No one knew till recently, and they probably still don't know, how high temperature superconductivity worked. There's lots, Newton didn't know how gravity worked. We still don't. I mean, it's supposed to happen on the basis of gravitational particles, gravitons, that no one's ever detected. Lots of phenomena can be recognized as phenomena without a theory. However, I do have a theory. I didn't go into the theory today because I was mostly talking about the phenomena. I have a theory of morphic fields and morphic resonance, which I put forward in my first two books, A New Science of Life and The Presence of the Past. And when I did that, people said, OK, you've got this theory, where's the evidence? Now I concentrate on evidence. People say, OK, here's the evidence, where's the theory? Well, there is a theory, and I think the theory of morphic fields of social groups, for example, makes some predictions. Telepathy should occur between people you know well, much more than people you don't, for example. It should be independent of distance. It makes a number of predictions which these experiments test and so far support. And then there are other theories that some people have quantum theories of telepathy, you know, quantum entanglement theories, those make certain predictions too, which are being tested. So there's not just one theory, there are several. So I think this is a truly valid field of science. It's based on experiments, data, theories, predictions, tests. I think it meets all the criteria. Far better, actually, than many orthodox areas of science like superstring theory, which makes no testable predictions, or multi-universe theories in cosmology, which postulate quadrillions of unobserved universes for which there's not a shred of evidence. You can say that kind of thing and hold down prestigious chairs in leading universities. So, you know, one has to be aware of double standards about this kind of thing.
Thanks.
Actually, I'm not surprised at all. My mom always tells me that she thought about me when I was calling, and she lives in Europe.
Yes.
But I have actually a different question. Do you think that art and the media and our television and movies, in fact, exist to create this entanglement of society and these shared intuitions? So it's, in a sense, not very surprising, because we are using these products of arts and all these communications media.
Very interesting point. You know, the joint attention, which I was talking about as the basis of these minds when you're all seeing the same thing. In child development, by the age of about 1, normal children develop what's called joint attention. And that's why you see parents and their babies reading books together, walking along streets, they see a dog and they hear doggy, and everyone says, you know, it's just looking at the same thing, pointing, seeing things is part of normal development. People who don't do that are often autistic. So part of our normal human consciousness throughout human history has involved the ability to form this kind of mental resonance with other people. Consciousness is a shared phenomenon in many ways. Now, in traditional societies, you know, a storyteller would have the attention of a whole group sitting around a fire, for example. So that's, again, an old phenomenon. But what modern media have done is extended this to an unprecedented level through link-ups, TV link-ups like the Oscars or the Olympic Games, where literally billions of people are seeing the same thing at the same time. And I think this takes something that's a normal human phenomenon to a totally new level. And I think it does play a part in social cohesion and in the way our societies work. But it's extraordinarily uninvestigated. And nobody's ever done an experiment to find out whether people can tell whether they're seeing the same thing as millions of others or not at the same time. And as I say, I think these experiments can easily be done given the media that we now have. Let me just, an opportunity to mention another experiment that may interest people here, because this is people knowing about computers. I set up a joint attention sound experiment on the internet, but my coding, the programmer hasn't yet got it to work. But how that works is you have samples of 10 clips, sound clips. 5 of them are real radio stations that both broadcast in real time and on the internet. So you've got sounds there, music's being listened to by millions of people. Some of the ones we used, for example, or talking, some were Chinese talk shows from Shanghai. We then have another 5 clips, which are recordings of similar radio stations, recorded days, weeks, hours before. And after listening to each clip, you have to guess, was this a recording or was it live? So that's another form this can be done using internet technologies. As I say, I haven't got it to work yet because we had buffering problems and time lags. These were entirely technical problems we haven't solved. But this kind of thing is perfectly doable.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you for your talk. And I have a quick question. If you start with the premise that the mind extends beyond the body through space, then I think there's a very little stretch to imagine that it can extend through time. And I was wondering if, for instance, for your phone experiment, you've run such an experiment where, for instance, you would have the subject try to predict who's going to call before a random number generator would select the person who will actually place the call.
Yes, I've done that. I have a precognitive version of my text message test and also of the email test, where we changed the programming so that we ask people to say who's going to email you shortly or who's going to send you a text message. They send back their guess, and the second the guess received by the computer, it does the randomization and gets the person to do it. Those results have been coming out at chance levels so far. We haven't done very many of them, fewer than we've done in the telepathy mode. But that it can be done with this kind of online programmed experiment. You can just flip the program to a precognitive or telepathic
So you
mode.
haven't received any
Not in that
significant
case.
positive results.
No, not in those cases. But I think that the evidence for what Dean Radin calls presentiment, feeling a few seconds in advance about getting a kind of pre-echo of an emotional arousal, the evidence for that is very strong. And so I think there are ways in which there are future influences of a rather mysterious kind that can influence us. And of course, the minds extend in time in the past, which is what memory is all about. So memory and collective memory. I have a theory of collective memory called morphic resonance. This is another major part of my research that I haven't talked about at all this afternoon. But I think the minds are extended in space and in time. They're extended in time even through our intentions. Every intention we have, a future intention, like where I'm going after I've been here, which train I'm going to catch on BART, all these things are future intentions, where I'm going tomorrow. Our minds stretch into the future all the time through our intentions. We're connected to the past through our memories. And I think that some of these depend on things that science doesn't at present have on its map of reality. But our minds, I would say in short, are extended in space and time. They're not just in our brains now.
Thank you.
I have a couple of possible questions here. First one is, I had a lot of trouble with your vision analogy. And I wondered, is that just an analogy, or do you actually mean that to be another manifestation of your theories of morphic fields and the way the mind works?
You mean vision being projected out?
Yes.
It's not just an analogy. Well, the word projection is a kind of analogy or metaphor, but the idea that our vision is extended, I think that my image of you is where you are now. I don't think it's in my brain. No, I really think that's not just an analogy. And it's not just, as I say, it's not just my theory. If you take a sort of majority vote of people and theories through the ages, it would be the kind of 99% of humanity's theory of vision. The theory, it's all in the brain, dates back to Kepler and Descartes in the 17th century. And has never really been terribly successful, because in consciousness studies, one of the really big debates is, how does visual perception work? Is there a virtual reality display inside the head? If so, where is it? How does it work? And if it's virtual, why should it be stopped by the skull rather than go through it?
How do you account for, if you cut the optic nerve, a person's going to go blind, or if you damage a part of the brain, they're going to go blind, or if you damage another part of the brain, they're going to lose a lot of capacity.
Oh, that's certainly true. I'm saying light comes in, changes happen in the brain, the projection goes out. So cut any part of that circuit, and it's not going to work. You know, it's like the TV set, to take a somewhat different analogy, the picture you see on your TV depends on the electric supply, on the transistors, the condensers, the wiring, but also on a transmission coming from outside. I think the brain is actually more like a TV set, a receiver, and so on, with influences coming. If you cut the wire, pull the plug out, cut a few wires on the TV set, the screen will go blank. But that doesn't prove it's all inside the TV set.
Okay, one other quick question, if you will. This would seem to be enormously useful for survival. How come we aren't a lot better at it than we seem to be?
For spying.
What?
Surviving, you say. Oh,
for survival, sure.
It is an interesting question. You see, if you look at the use of these abilities in traditional societies, I used to live in India, and I worked there, and in India, most people took these things for granted. In Africa, they take them for granted, and they use them in a way that is helping in surviving. People go to people who are desperately ill, and when they need them, not because they've got a phone call, because they just feel this. Mothers go to their babies. In our society, first of all, we've got technology that works really well, probably better than telepathy, you know, telephones, emails, and so forth. And secondly, we live in a society where educated people have been brought up to disbelieve in these things. We've all been taught, if not explicitly, at least implicitly, it's a kind of illusion. Only stupid people believe this kind of thing. If you're smart, you've got to be a skeptic. And if you're a skeptic, you know it's just sort of faulty statistics.
So you think we're kind of de-evolving ourselves in this regard, then?
Well, despite all attempts to suppress it in our society, it's actually coming out more and more through modern technologies. Telephone telepathy, as I say, is the commonest kind. And until telephones were invented, I think probably there was less of it around. I think more people are experiencing telepathy today than they did a couple of generations ago, because so many people have phones and even cell phones. So it's a constant presence in their lives.
Thank you.
Hi. So I just had a question about, it seems like there's a couple of different kinds of social fields. I mean, at the beginning of the talk, you showed these pictures of flocks of birds and schools
Yes.
of fish, and they had a very kind of specific geometry to them.
Yes.
And then towards the end of the talk, you were talking about people interacting, and you were saying how these experiments don't seem to depend much, or the results don't depend much on the distance that separates them. So I just wonder if we're seeing the effects of two different kinds of fields, or is it just the same kind of field and it's, I don't really
No,
know.
that's a very, no, the question is, it's an important one because the flocks and the schools of fish depend on position and exactly its coordinating positions of movement. And I think that's a kind of social field primarily concerned with the coordination of movement. Where we experience that is when we're walking along the street, it's surprising how rarely you bump into people. And in countries like India, it's amazing when you see the chaos of the traffic system, how the whole thing just keeps flowing and people weave between each other. It's the same with traffic systems here, which are a bit more regulated. I think this is something we almost take for granted, but it's actually rather amazing how rarely we bump into people or things, and people can flow through each other and so on. So I think that's one of the aspects of social fields which are to do with movement coordination. There's another kind which work at a distance which are more to do with calls. And one kind of telepathy is to do with calls. You're in need, you desperately need help. You can sort of, and someone can pick it up and come to you. That is the kind which I think has now evolved along, co-evolved with telephones and emails and things, because they are actually calls. Not necessarily always with a high emotional need or content, but sometimes. So I think, yes, that it's not just one kind of field that does all these things. They're all versions of the social field, but carrying out different functions. One, movement coordination. And that's something which in termite nests, ants' nests, and bees' hives, when they're building structures together, you get cooperative architectural activities. That kind of field which coordinates movement in a spatial way must be very important. But the core ones are almost, by definition, to do with relating to absent members of the group and trying to bring them back. So it's a kind of extension of that field, but it's not exactly the same.
Thank you.
So I find the idea of entangled minds very interesting and plausible, but what I don't see how the minds would manage to meet. I feel intuitively it must be possible for two minds to meet each other in a sense without meeting physically or seeing each other or having any connection in a physical sense. Do you have any ideas on how this might happen?
Well, I think minds get entangled through interactions. Our minds meet through interactions, and these don't have to be through physical meetings. They can be through emails, through social networking sites, through telephone, and so forth. But it's interesting, isn't it, that despite our incredible connectivity today, the airlines are still full of business passengers flying around the world to meetings. And you would think that airlines would have gone out of business if minds could interact just through international communication systems. There seems to be something more about the interaction that occurs in person when there's a bodily presence. And that's, of course, much more a natural form of interaction. Your whole body interacts through implicit understanding of social body language, movements, gestures, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in personal meetings, there's a far more intense and varied level of interaction than in just conversations where it's only the voices that are interacting, or in emails where it's just the written words that are interacting. But of course, you can interact in that way, and people do build up quite close connections or relationships at a distance. And that interaction would be enough, I think, to set up a field where you could still get telepathic connections in those contexts. But the vast majority of telepathy as it occurs in the ordinary world is between parents and children, best friends, lovers, husbands and wives, close colleagues, and so forth. And I haven't actually studied it in the context of social networking, where you may have people who become very close friends or closely linked without ever having met physically. It would be interesting to find out how telepathic they are.
I'm back. I really like your TV analogy. So if you cut a wire inside a TV, it stops working. If you cut the optic nerve, this person stops seeing. If the TV station stops sending the field to the TV doesn't work. What
Yes.
fills in the hole?
Pardon?
What fills in the hole? So what has to break for the person with a perfectly functional brain to stop seeing?
Well, I haven't quite got your point yet.
So if there's really an analogy between
Yes.
a field that a TV is receiving as
Yes.
being something that, some sort of a field that a brain is receiving, in order to be able to project an image
Yes.
or to see, to have a vision, then, so the physical analogy I understand, breaking something physical
Yes.
inside the TV and breaking something physical inside the brain, both break the vision. It's easy to break the electromagnetic field and see the TV
Yes.
not work. How can this field that human brains have can break?
Well, there's several ways that happen. First of all, when we go to sleep, it all goes blank. So it depends on our state of consciousness, and much of the time, hours a day, we're not seeing anything. When we are asleep, if we dream, then we have an interesting situation where there's a kind of projective activity of the brain and of our minds can go on when we're not actually seeing what we're seeing in the dream. And those are more like hallucinatory images. Some people, when they take hallucinogenic substances and close their eyes, would see all sorts of things that aren't really there. And interestingly, people subject to extreme sensory deprivation, kept in darkness for weeks, like in some Tibetan meditation practices, often experience very vivid hallucinations. There's also ways in which our attention's extremely selective, and we see what we want to see, and we don't notice lots of other things. So there's something that attention itself can lead to attentional blindness, or what psychologists call inattentional blindness, things that you're not paying attention to, you're blind to, even though they're there and affecting your field of vision. That might be more equivalent to the sort of hole in the mind, as it were. There's a famous video lots of people have seen where people are playing a ball game and someone in a gorilla suit walks through the room, and you tell people to count how many times they bounce the ball, and most people count and tell you, and they never see this guy, and they say, look again, do you see anyone in a gorilla suit? And people can't believe that they haven't seen this. It's a very clear demonstration of this form of inattentional blindness.
And you think this cannot be explained by physical processes in the brain?
Well, it can be explained by attention or inattention. But then, you see, we come back to the question of the nature of consciousness itself. What controls attention and how does attention work? Then we come to the vexed question of how does consciousness work? How does the mind work? And in the world of consciousness studies, the scientific field in which these things are studied, there's no general agreement on what attention is, how the mind works, what the mind is, what its relation to the brain is. This is really, truly, I think, one of the most exciting frontier areas of science, where there's a variety of different theories. There's no consensus view. There is a consensus view on what happens in the brain. You can measure it. But how that relates to the mind, to attention, and so forth, that's a realm of wild speculation at the moment, with vying schools of thought. And it's a paradox, really, that the thing we know least about is our own minds and their relationship to our bodies. And it's partly because science has ignored this. Until about 20 years ago, consciousness was virtually ignored by most scientists, even psychologists. In the 20th century, behaviorism was the dominant school of psychology in American and British universities. And that said, forget consciousness, all we're going to do is measure objective behavior, movements of muscles, secretions of glands, things you can measure. That's objective. The rest is subjective, and it's no part of science. But now we recognize subjectivity, consciousness is part of science, and we need to think about it scientifically. But it's a field of science that's quite new, and where, in a way, we're on a new frontier here.
Thanks.
I came towards the second half of your talk, later in the talk, so this question might have already been answered. Most of the experiments seem to be proving or finding out whether certain phenomena exist or not. Has there been any experiments conducted which find out the environment that is conducive to produce such effects?
Yes. I mean, among people who work in parapsychology, there have been a number of experiments that look at variables affecting the results. Generally speaking, people do better if they're feeling relaxed and not under stress. The telepathy tests work better with people you know well than with strangers. So there are a variety of things that affect how people respond in these tests. Also, some people do better than others. And there's a long line of research in parapsychology called the sheep-goat studies that show the kinds of results you get depend on what you believe. Skeptics sometimes get less successful results than people who believe they're possible. Sometimes, indeed, skeptics get significant negative results, showing that there's something in the sort of, they're somehow getting it, but giving the opposite answer, as it were. So a variety of factors, personal, social, and environmental, affect these results. This is a field of research in which relatively little has been done. I mean, the people who are doing this work in the US, about 50% of the research effort is in this room with Dean Radin and Marilyn Schlitz. And, you know, this is not a field where there's hundreds or thousands of people working. There's very, very few. In India, I don't know of anyone. There was one, Narasimha Rao, in Andhra University who did this research. But like in India, there's probably one retired person doing it. In England, there's about 10 or 15 people in universities. But this is there's a huge amount of research could be done in these areas that hasn't been done because, not because it's difficult, not even because it's very expensive, but because the taboo has held back this field of research. Hopefully it's breaking down now. And I think we'll see that there's a great deal we could find out that would be of great interest to a lot of people.
Thank you. Being a street smart, that hard to define skill. I have found that many entrepreneurs, the reasons why they get ahead is because they know to whom to trust, which employees to hire, to which customers to extend more credit. And is any way to identify that skill, and is any way to teach it?
Good question. I think that the word that most people would use for these abilities, the general word, would be intuition. And intuition is a blanket term that covers a variety of these abilities, able to feel premonitions, pick up subtle cues, all sorts of things are involved in intuition. And I think it's also very likely, as you say, that people who do well in business are people who use intuitive skills. Because business people are always, in fact, all of us are working in an atmosphere of uncertainty where you can't be sure. In science, there's an attempt to try and pin things down and make them more certain. But scientists have to be intuitive too, because they have to hire people and know who to trust, just like everyone else does. And also have intuitions about what kind of research is worth doing, what kind of experiments are worth trusting. There are people who claim to train intuition. There are lots of people who give workshops on training your intuition. Whether they work or not, I don't know. I'd like them to put their participants through some of my telepathy tests before the workshop and after it, and we could then quantify whether people are at least getting better at these kinds of tests. But at the moment, there's a disconnection between people who do scientific tests in this area and people who claim to be able to train intuition in this area. And it's not quite clear, how well they're doing it or how successful they are. I think they probably can train it. I think these are things that we can train. There's no reason in principle why we shouldn't be able to train our intuition in these areas, just as we can train our physical skills in things like playing the piano or train our taste buds and noses in getting to know about wine and that kind of thing. Everything in principle should be trainable.
So if the effect is so strong, in a sense, from all the experiments that you conducted, then why, after a long time of scientific skepticism and still, is now the data becoming available?
Well, it's partly a question of, who sees the data. The data are there. There's quite a lot of data. Dean Radin summarized it in his books very well, I think. The Conscious Universe and his recent book, Entangled Minds, are a very good review of this scientific experimental data. It doesn't get out there very much. And this is partly a sociological question. It's to do with the taboo. For example, I've submitted several of my papers to my work on the dogs, for example. I submitted that to Animal Behavior, which is the leading journal on animal behavior. This is animal behavior. And I got a letter back from the editor saying, I'm rejecting your paper immediately without refereeing, because no referee for this journal would take seriously any paper that claimed that so-called telepathy actually existed. I've just had another paper rejected on those grounds. The replication of my telephone telepathy paper was rejected by Perception magazine. And the editor there said, any experiment that shows positive results for telepathy must be flawed. So he was rejecting it without refereeing. And when the author of the paper wrote to the editor saying, well, surely you remember that Galileo had a problem with the cardinals who refused to look through the telescope. Aren't you afraid you might be a bit like the cardinals? The guy wrote back, said, that's a risk I'm prepared to take. At least he was honest. So there is a very strong prejudice, and anyone who works in this field encounters it. Media reports in serious media like the New York Times, Scientific American, are dominated by a skeptical point of view. And if any positive report is there, they immediately wheel on a media skeptic like Michael Shermer to say it's all rubbish. They get the last word. So it's a sociological phenomenon, I would say. The data is there. And I think that it's a taboo that mainly affects educated people who've had a scientific background because they feel they'll lose credibility. My own view is that the way things would change is not through piling up more data, but by the equivalent of the gay liberation movement within science. I gave a talk at a unit in Cambridge where there were 6 staff members who attended my seminar. I was talking about my work with dogs. And afterwards, each one of the 6 came up to me and said, you know, I'm really interested in this stuff. I think it happens. I've seen it with my own dog, you know, but I can't talk about it here because everyone in this department's so straight. And when all 6, including the professor, had said the same thing to me, I said to them, you know, why don't you guys come out? You'd have so much more fun if you could actually talk freely. And I think science would be so much more fun if people talked freely. In every scientific institute, there are people who've had these experiences, who have dogs that know when they're coming home from the lab and that kind of thing. But the social taboo means they don't feel they can talk about it. And I think if we let go of that, I'm not saying blind belief is what we need. We certainly don't. We need rational scientific discussion, but that's inhibited by prejudice and taboo, and it facilitated by free conversation.
Well, there have been other scientific theories which have been not well received, but you know, the scientific community was eventually made to see the light. Why is this different?
I asked myself that question. Why is it that this field has so much taboo around it when others don't? For example, the Astronomer Royal in Britain, President of the Royal Society, Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, Lord Rees, member of the House of Lords, believes in multiple universes. He holds down the highest positions you can possibly have in British scientific life. He hasn't a shred of evidence for them. Yet that's acceptable, where telepathy is not. Why? I think the reason is that in the Enlightenment at the end of the 18th century, the movement of the Enlightenment was a movement to liberate humanity from religion and superstition in favor of science and reason. That was the social movement. And I think at that time, things like telepathy and what are called paranormal phenomena were classified as superstition. And since then, there's been a sociological phenomenon where smart people are defined as smart by not believing these things, which is why newspapers with a demographic of university graduates, like the New York Times, can't write about them, whereas ones that, with readers with no intellectual pretensions, like the National Enquirer, feel completely free to write about these things in an exaggerated and totally unreliable form. And that, of course, reinforces the social taboo. And so it's a self-reinforcing sociological pattern. And I think it's so strong because it was embedded among educated people somewhere around 1800. You know, there was a reaction against mesmerism and that kind of thing. And I think it's remained embedded in the intellectual world ever since, and it's become a deep-seated habit of thought. That's my own view.
So what then is a morphic field if it's not, say, an electromagnetic field or gravitational field, or what is it?
A morphic field.
How do we actually measure it directly?
We can't measure any field directly. We measure them through their effects. We measure electrical fields through electrical effects, gravitational fields through gravitational
measure
effects.
it through an instrument rather than having to have a human sort of part of the equation, say on the receiving end at least.
Well,
or on the sending end, either way.
You measure these, well, you measure them through their appropriate effects. There's no reason to suppose a morphic field might be measurable by an electrical instrument if it interacts with electrical activity in a way that's measurable by that instrument. It might do, it might not. It's an open question for me. But the first thing to do is to measure them by their actual biological effects. Just as you measure gravity through gravitational effects like the swinging of pendulums and things. You don't measure gravity with an electric meter. You measure it with gravitational things like gravitational devices, pendulums and whatnot.
So are you trying to characterize these fields? Things like gravity inverse d squared law, electromagnetism as well.
Oh, I am. I've left out the whole of the
delays.
theory. Yes, I've spent 10 years developing this theory, written 2 books on it, etc., of how these fields work and what they are. And it's not really fair on this audience that I haven't actually gone into the theory. There's a lot more known than I said. But that's partly because it was all meant to take only an hour, 45 minutes for the talk and 15 for the questions. We're actually 25 minutes over time. But those were my instructions. Yes, very, very briefly, morphic fields organize self-organizing systems. They have a kind of built-in memory. They work by patterning indeterminate systems that would otherwise not have a pattern. They impose restrictions on otherwise chaotic or indeterminate systems. There are a lot of things you can say about the fields and ways in which you can test for them. But I can't, at 5:26 p.m., tell you what they are right now.
Sure, and I think there's people behind me.
There's a summary on my website of the morphic field theory, which you might like to look at. Yeah.
I'm intrigued by this notion of skepticism of telepathy because there's so much acceptance of other things like homeopathy and all the things that are skewered in the bad science column in The Guardian every week. So how come they get more play than they should, and people will take scientific bullshit from homeopathy vendors, but they won't accept physical results from you?
I think it depends who I'm talking to. I give seminars, I'm giving one in a couple of months' time, at Chris French's department at Goldsmiths College London, he's the main professor of skepticism in Britain. He's professor of anomalous psychology. And this is one of the main academic hotbeds of skepticism. I give talks there, people listen, we have reasonable discussions, and they know about the results. And very few of the people there exhibit this kind of prejudiced skepticism that I encounter all too often, a kind of ignorant, bigoted type of skepticism. I think one of the reasons that there's so much of that is that people who are really skeptical have such a strong belief that they know in advance the evidence must be wrong. You say, if you believe it's impossible, then if I come along and say, here's results that show it's possible, either it proves I'm a fool, I've done the experiment so badly or incompetently, I've got false positive results and haven't been smart enough to see it, or I'm a fraud. I'm trying to deceive you and the world. And so the instant reaction is one of hostility and accusing people of being fools or frauds. Richard Dawkins, who's a very smart man, is, in this area, not very smart at all. He's a very bigoted skeptic. And he came to interview me for his most recent TV series in Britain. He had one against religion, a 2-part polemic called The Root of All Evil. And his most recent series was called Enemies of Reason. It was about research in parapsychology and alternative medicine. They didn't tell me it was called Enemies of Reason beforehand when they asked me to take part, but I've had enough experience of these negative media treatments, and I'd seen his previous series that I was very suspicious, and I said I'll only agree to take part if it's a genuine scientific discussion about evidence, and if he's really open to discussing the evidence. Otherwise, there's no point. And they gave me and I said I want it in writing. They gave me a written assurance that this was the case. So I agreed to meet him, and he came to see me. And we started off, there was a handheld camera, they put us facing each other. And he started off by saying, he said, I dare say we agree about quite a number of things, Rupert. He said, but let me tell you what worries me about you. And I said, okay, what worries me about me? And he said, what worries me about you is you're prepared to believe almost anything, and science should be based on the minimum number of beliefs. So I said, well, okay, well, let me tell you what worries me about you. I said, you come across as prejudiced and bigoted, and I think you give science a bad name. So we didn't get very far with that conversation. So then he said, the trouble with telepathy is that people are, he said, oh no, then he said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. It's a standard skeptical slogan. So I said, well, what's the extraordinary claim? I said, the majority of sane, normal people in Britain believe they've had telepathic experiences. In that sense, it's not extraordinary, it's ordinary. Most people have had it. You're making the claim that most people are deluded about their own experience. Where's your extraordinary evidence for that? He couldn't produce any at all. You know, he just said, oh, people have a very false sense of statistics and probability and stuff, generic arguments. Then I said, well, look, okay, why don't we get down to the evidence and actually discuss the evidence, which is why we've met. And he said, I don't want to talk about the evidence. And I said, well, why not? And he said, there isn't time. And I said, well, we've got plenty of time. He said, it's too complicated. And I said, no, it isn't. He said, anyway, it's not what this program's about. And so I said, well, he didn't know. I'd sent him my papers, 3 or 4 papers, 2 weeks before so he could look at them. He hadn't looked at them. And he was just trying to trap me into saying something silly and then put that on TV.
Right.
So I said, okay, well then there's been a misunderstanding because I said I didn't want to take part in yet another low-grade debunking program. He said, it's not a low-grade debunking program, it's a high-grade debunking program. So then the producer said, cut, and the cameras stopped rolling. And so then I said to the director, is this a debunking program or not? He said, yes, it's another Richard Dawkins polemic. And I said, then you're here under false pretenses because you told me it was about evidence. He said, I didn't. I said, well, your assistant did. He said, can you prove it? And I said, yes. And I produced the email with this. And I said, I'm afraid there's been a serious misunderstanding. He said, well, I'm afraid I have to agree with you. That she should never have told you that. That's not what it's about. It's a polemic. I said, well, I'm going to have to ask you to leave my house. And I didn't sign a release. I wouldn't actually mind if all that was put on the TV, but I've written up an account of this. It's on my website. It's been published in several British journals. If you want to read the details, it's on an account called Richard Dawkins Comes to Call. But that's an example, you see, of someone with a huge media presence, an enormous intellectual prestige, because a lot of people think he's an incredibly smart guy who speaks for science. In this area, whatever his virtues as a geneticist, he doesn't know anything about it. He's speaking from prejudice and ignorance. And that's a very bad thing to do if you are, as he is, professor of public understanding of science. It doesn't further a public understanding of science. And that, I'm afraid, is why the debate on this is not often based on evidence and very often based on prejudice, stereotypes, and ignorance.
So the other thing that strikes me is that here at Google we run hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of experiments every day which are based on perceptions because we do present our testing on results and so on.
Yeah.
Like recently we changed the color of the results from one shade of blue to another because we found empirically that people preferred that.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if your theories and models of this could be potentially tainting our results because once we've shown it to 1% of people, that will change how the rest of them behave. Is there something we could measure in that?
Well, you could set up morphic resonance type experiments, which the one kind of experiment is which have actually been done, where you have some new kind of puzzle, you get people to solve it, and then you see if other people who haven't seen it can solve it more easily after one lot have done it. A version of it, this is morphic resonance, the memory theory I didn't talk about today. I think it could possibly influence your results, actually. I mean, a form in which I'd like to test it was thought up by my son when he was taking the national school exams, age 16 in England. We have a national exam called GCSE, General Certificate of Secondary Education, as you know. And he came to me one day and said, I and my friends have thought of a way of getting higher marks without doing extra work. And I said, that sounds good. How's that going to happen? He said, by morphic resonance. And I said, well, how will that work? And he said, well, in the physics and maths papers, we're going to do questions 15 and 16 first, then go back to question 1, 2, 3, etc. We'll be 10 minutes behind everyone else in Britain. And we get a boost by morphic resonance from their answers. Because all the exams are done simultaneously, of course, to avoid cheating. So I said to him, well, that's a really clever idea. And I said, but some of your friends must be morphic resonance skeptics. And he said, yes, they are. And I said, what did they say? And they said, what if morphic resonance doesn't exist? And he said, we discussed it. We came to the conclusion if it doesn't exist, we wouldn't lose any marks. But if it does, we'd gain them. So we're all going to do it. They all did it. They all got A stars. But they were probably smart in the first place to think of that. But that provides a perfect example of a test, you see. I tried to persuade the head of science exams in the Oxford-Cambridge Examination Board, an old classmate of mine, to turn our entire national education exam system into a test where have several of the questions in a different order. So you could see if, and they'd be randomly assigned to thousands, tens of thousands of candidates, to see whether people who did questions after others were getting higher scores. He thought it was a really good idea for a few days. Then he called me and said, you know, I'm going to be retiring soon and I want to have a full pension and you know, I just don't think I can run this test. Anyway, in Google you probably could, and it would be that certain kinds of test like that would be influenced by what other people have done. I don't know how it would relate to what you do. Google would be a wonderful arena for this kind of research.
Well, these test analyses that are run continuously to try out AdWords and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah.
Yes. I don't know enough about how things work here to suggest simple, easy to do, low-cost experiments that could be done using existing Google technologies, but I'm sure they could be done. Yeah. So now we've reached 5:35. Is there a cut-off, Isaac? Or, I mean, I'm happy to go on a few more minutes, but perhaps we should draw things. Yes, one more question, yes.
Have there been any experiments with people with known special abilities, like being able to guess things? Or
not special abilities?
No, known special abilities.
Oh, known special abilities. I haven't myself worked with people with known special abilities because I prefer to work with ordinary people because I'm interested in what I call the mysteries of everyday life. You know, the things that ordinary people know about. If you work with people who are professional psychics, then the skeptics are particularly active. They say, oh, they're cheating. They've learned how to cheat because they're constantly cheating people out of money and stuff. And it's very hard to get beyond that kind of argument when you're dealing with, say, Sai Baba materializing Vibhuti or something like that. It's very hard to replicate, too, because really, people with special abilities don't particularly want to be treated as frauds and tested repeatedly by aggressive and hostile skeptics. So I prefer to work with ordinary people testing ordinary abilities. But that doesn't mean to say that it wouldn't be interesting to test people who do have extraordinary abilities or who are unusually sensitive. And the intuition test on mobile phones that I was talking about earlier, if people did these intuition tests, a lot of people would be able to identify themselves as being unusually good at telephone telepathy. And they would then be very good people to test in a more rigorous way. So hopefully that kind of test could allow people to identify their own abilities and indeed improve them by training and experience.